So one of the first things that I always think about when I'm shooting a video is, especially if I'm shooting something that is like going to be handheld or shooting B-roll or anything like that, is how do I keep it stable? And before, it actually used to be really difficult to get stable footage. You were either kind of stuck with just shooting handheld and trying to keep it as stable as possible, or you maybe were looking at like a Steadicam or a gimbal. But years ago, I remember when I first started, Steadicams, like a good Steadicam or a good gimbal, were thousands of dollars. Like, they were way too expensive for an average person or a hobbyist or, you know, someone just starting out to really have access to. But now that those things have gotten so much cheaper, all of it has become a lot more accessible, and you have so many more options now as well for how to keep your video stable. Modern cameras, lenses, they all have different ways of having like some kind of in-body stabilization or in-lens stabilization. There are digital and software options out there that are getting better and better, and then of course you have the options like gimbals and Steadicams and other pieces of equipment that are designed to help keep your footage as stable as possible. So in this video, what I'm going to basically put to test is all of the different video stabilization options that are available for Sony cameras. And basically what I want to find out is, of all of the readily available and relatively cheap options available out there for keeping your video stable, which one gets you the best results? So the way that I'm going to test that is, I've got my Sony a7 IV, which has the most up-to-date, as far as I'm aware, in-body 5-axis stabilization. I've also got a couple of lenses, some that don't have any kind of optical stabilization, and some Sony lenses that do have optical stabilization built in. And I also have my gimbal as well. In addition to using physical ways of stabilizing it, like just going handheld or using a gimbal or the in-body stabilization, I'm also going to test out some of the software options available as well. And to help me out, I've got my buddy Keaton.
Howdy.
We're gonna go do a little bit of off-roading in this absolute missile of an SUV. All right, buddy, give us the tour. What are we working with?
So we've got a 1991 Nissan Pathfinder Nismo. A couple key features about this bad boy: 3.5 liter V6, rear lock, or limited slip rear lock and diff, lock center diff, differential in the front, I think. No, it is. It's 4-wheel drive. Came with a good old-fashioned off-roading hatchet and shovel and roof rack and some off-roading bolt cutters. So as far as rattling, this thing's gonna do it.
And one of the things I do want to point out is the ground that we're working with is basically just snow and dirt. So I'm going to try to do my best to keep it stable, but what is this guy doing?
Get in, loser! We're going off-roading!
So we've gone about
100 meters?
Yeah, about 100 meters. And we're stuck.
Pro tip for off-roading: always bring a friend that can work the shovel for you while you work his expensive camera.
Hey! All right, so we went off-roading. We technically did. We did go off-roading for a little bit.
Yeah.
We did go off of the road. We got stuck. We got unstuck many times.
Yeah.
Almost got taken out by some douchebags driving way too fast on a snowy road.
We're once again underdressed for what we did.
We are once again cold and our feet are wet, which happens more times than it probably should when we're out shooting videos, so.
Yeah, I gotta say, and more so, like this happens to me more so with you than anyone else I know.
Overall, successful day. Didn't get to do any of the gimbal testing, but we'll save that for tomorrow. Do something else cool with it, but yeah, that was a fun little time.
Thanks for coming on my first off-roading adventure.
Gotcha, buddy. So now that I've gotten a chance to take a look at the footage that we got from the past couple of days, let's talk about what I noticed with all of these different stabilization methods. So obviously when we're talking about handheld footage versus some kind of gimbal or stabilized footage using stabilization equipment, handheld is never going to be as smooth as using some kind of stabilizing equipment. We know that. There's no real need to test that out, right? But the reason I shot with handheld and 0 assists whatsoever is because I wanted to establish a baseline so that we can see for all of these stabilization methods available for Sony cameras, and more so the more recent Sony cameras that have been released in the past, I would say 3 to 5-ish years. I want to see which of those options that are available to Sony cameras gives you the most significant results. And so in order to do that, we have to set a baseline by shooting with handheld, no stabilization whatsoever, and then kind of build on top of that and use each of these methods individually. So let's talk about the results. Starting with the handheld footage, the in-body stabilization, or IBIS, Sony calls it steady shot, does reduce motion a fair bit. It reduces small motions quite well, and it basically reduces how accentuated they are. And by small motions, I mean very small ups and downs from like things like footsteps, or if you're doing a handheld pan, it can help smooth out that pan so that, you know, if you're a little bit jittery, it's not going to show it as much through the footage. But it is not something that eliminates motion by any means. Now with OSS, or optical steady shot, you basically have a stabilization mechanism built into the lens itself to kind of smooth those small motions a little bit. Now, as awesome as that sounds, when you're shooting handheld and using only OSS, from what I saw, it made no difference whatsoever. If it did make a small difference, it was so small, it was almost negligible. For the handheld shots, when I was using both in-body image stabilization and optical steady shot, the results were actually quite significant. The OSS plus IBIS combo actually made my footage look like I was using some kind of warp stabilizer. So you do get a good bit of distortion and kind of perspective warp on the edges of your shot. And considering when we were doing the handheld stuff, I was walking on a very uneven road. It was a dirt road with a bunch of packed down snow. Considering all of that, it did a great job of smoothing it out. So I imagine if you're shooting on a smoother surface, like if you're walking on a smooth sidewalk, you might actually get much better results than I did. Now, moving on to the gimbal shots. Obviously with the gimbal, everything was much smoother. So for all of the gimbal shots, I did have the distinct advantage of being able to walk on a very smooth, nice, like even sidewalk rather than that rough road that was covered in snow that we were shooting on with the handheld stuff. But even if we were on a rough surface, you still would get much smoother footage just out the bat with that gimbal. So looking at the gimbal footage where I was not using any kind of assists, just using the gimbal, you can notice that some of the left and right pans, some of the ups and downs weren't really that smooth. They were smooth in that it was one continuous motion once it started, but when I was panning left and right, it would kind of suddenly start panning or suddenly stop panning rather than a very smooth transition from a push to a pan. So that could be down to the specific gimbal that I used, the calibration that I had on it, the way that I was moving with the gimbal. So a lot of different factors could affect that. But when we're looking at the gimbal footage with some of the assists, we can see how layering on some of those assists on top of using a gimbal can really help improve your footage. For one, in-body stabilization does actually give you a pretty small improvement in the smoothness of your footage. OSS, unfortunately, again, doesn't do a whole lot. But when we use the gimbal in conjunction with IBIS and OSS, it actually gave us some significantly better results. Now, let's talk about some of these software options for stabilization. So the two software stabilizers that I used was Premiere Pro's Warp Stabilizer effect, which I left on the completely standard stock settings for all of the clips using Warp Stabilizer. And on top of that, I also used Sony's Catalyst Browse software, which takes advantage of the gyroscopic data that's embedded now in modern Sony cameras and uses that to help stabilize the footage. So let's talk about Warp Stabilizer first. On a lot of the handheld shots, Warp Stabilizer rendered the clips completely unusable. Warp Stabilizer basically tries to analyze frame by frame the motion happening in your footage, and then it bends and stretches the corners of your footage to try to reduce as much motion and as much difference between each of the frames as possible. Now, in doing so, you get a lot of distortion and a lot of warping, especially around those edges, because that's what the effect is doing. So basically, for any of my clips that had any more motion than a simple push or a simple pan, it would completely ruin and completely distort the footage. Now, when we applied the warp stabilizer to our gimbal footage, it actually did a really good job because we had a really good baseline of pretty smooth footage to begin with. However, for these shots with a lot of motion, warp stabilizer can sometimes still warp your footage in a very noticeable and uncomfortable way. So for some of these bigger motions, warp stabilizer will wind up rendering that section useless. But if you're starting with very smooth footage to begin with, warp stabilizer can really actually help smooth out some of the things that the gimbals can't. Now let's move on to Sony's Catalyst Browse software, or the gyro stabilization. There is no arguing with the results that Sony's gyro stabilization can achieve. It's still a software stabilization, but because it has the gyro data from your camera, and it can actually work out in 3D space where your camera is and where it moves in 3D space, it stabilizes your footage in a far better way and with far less distortion and warping than a purely software stabilizer like a warp stabilizer would. And when you apply the catalyst stabilization to your gimbal footage, it's almost perfect. Now here's the problem though. As good as Sony's catalyst stabilization is, and as impressive as the results are, the software itself is a pain in the ass to use. So consider this, you're editing an entire project within Premiere Pro, and you notice that the clips that you shot weren't as smooth as you want them to. So for every single clip, you want to apply some kind of stabilization to it. Well, if you're using Catalyst Browse, you have to then exit out of Premiere Pro, open up the Catalyst software. You have to then find your clips, apply the stabilization to each and every clip, export each and every clip separately, and on top of that, when you export, if you're shooting in 422, it exports in 420. So you lose that additional power for color grading and processing later on for all of those clips that you've applied the stabilization to. And then after that, you then have to import your footage into Premiere, then you have to trim it up in Premiere, and then you can restart the process that way. If you have a lot of B-roll or if you have a lot of footage that you need to stabilize, it can add hours and hours of work. And to add insult to injury, the Catalyst Browse software is terribly slow at times, crashed for me all the time, and it basically was just overall a pain to use. So with all of that said, we still have to answer the question, what's the best way to stabilize your footage? So in my experience, in order to get the absolute smoothest footage possible, your best option is using a gimbal, trying to be as smooth as possible with the gimbal, shoot with your IBIS and OSS turned on, shoot on a wider lens, and then apply catalyst stabilization afterwards. Now, if you're shooting handheld, in order to get the smoothest footage possible, your best bet is to shoot with IBIS turned on, using a non-OSS wide-angle lens, so no optical stabilization, and then apply the catalyst stabilization afterwards. I'd recommend avoiding warp for handheld altogether because of how much distortion it's going to give you. Now again, that's not the most efficient workflow. If you want to find that balance of efficient editing and production workflow, as well as smooth, cool, cinematic looking footage, your best bet is to shoot handheld with IBIS and OSS turned on. Now, if you find that using the combination of IBIS and OSS is giving you a ton of distortion, then you might want to consider using a non-OSS lens and then saving catalyst stabilization for the clips that really need it. All right, guys, so that's pretty much it. That concludes our Sony Stabilization Showdown. So hopefully this video has helped you out a little bit in determining which method is best for you to use to get the smoothest footage possible. And obviously this isn't the most comprehensive test. We didn't test out like a Steadicam or, sliders or anything like that. And on top of that, all of the footage was shot in a very run and gun kind of way. But what I wanted to do was kind of replicate what a natural setting for using these methods would look like. So when you guys are out shooting vlogs or travel videos or whatever else you might be doing and you don't have access to full-on production equipment, you can utilize these methods and you can know what the benefit and sacrifices are for each of these methods. And hopefully this helps you out in the long term with getting smoother and better looking footage. If you found this video helpful, make sure you hit that like button. If you enjoyed this video, if you learned something from it and you want to see more videos like this in the future, make sure you hit that subscribe button and turn your notifications on so you know when the next video comes out. All right, everyone, I'll see y'all in the next one.